A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, fellow audience. Welcome back to Sinar Daily for another episode of Wachana English Edition with me, Meor Addelan, accompanying you tonight on this glorious Friday night, the 17th of March 2023. Just a bit of a reminder to all of you folks out there, we're maybe about a few more days until Ramadan sets upon us. So, yeah, a happy early Ramadan to all of you, wherever it is that you may be. All right, for tonight's episode is going to be a very interesting discussion that we have catered just for you. It is a very serious topic. It is something that a lot of us may not be familiar with, hence why we have taken it upon ourselves to bring it to you on the Wachana English Edition live tonight. Allow me to begin tonight's session by giving you a bit of an introduction of what we are to speak about. Malaysia has actually shown its intention to move towards abolishing the mandatory death penalty since a moratorium on the death penalty was put in place in 2018. And as of February 2022, 1,341 people were reported to be on death row in Malaysia, including 506, which is about 38%, foreign nationals. And with the winding road to abolishing the mandatory death penalty coming into sight, we examine the potential impacts it will have upon our country. And last year, the former Law Minister, Wan Junaidi Tuanku Jaafar, has actually said that the government has agreed to abolish the mandatory death penalty. And currently, 11 offences carry the mandatory death penalty in Malaysia, including for drug-related offences, which make up the majority of death penalty cases. And the decision by the cabinet actually would give judges discretion in sentencing. And these amendments would still need to be tabled and passed in Parliament before they take effect. However, will this signal more equitable punishment and reforms within our own justice system? Will it leave a big impact on our society, whether it is a positive or a negative way? And that is why we are going to be diving deep into this discussion today with our panels of experts. Allow me to introduce to you our panel. Starting from my left, we have the Deputy Law and Institutional Reforms Minister, YB Ramkarpal Singh. YB, thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. And of course, beside her, we have from the Amnesty International Malaysia Executive Director, Katrina Joreen Maliamau. I hope I pronounced that right.
You did a good job.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And of course, beside her, we have the Suhakam Commissioner, Mr. Raghunath K7. Sir, how are you doing, sir?
Very good, thank you.
All right, lovely. So shall we get things started with today's discussion?
Yes.
It's definitely going to be a very fruitful one. Let's start things off with the first block, which is the abolishment of mandatory death penalty. I'm drawn to you first, YB, to ask the first question of the night. Why should the mandatory death penalty be abolished, sir?
Well, I think when we talk about the death penalty, it is a form. It is a form of sentence, and like in in every sentence meted out by the courts, there are certain objectives behind the sentencing exercise. One of which is obviously to rehabilitate the person that is being sentenced. So the question of rehabilitation obviously would not arise in the case of a person sentenced to death, because if he's sentenced to death, he's not going to come out back into the community in the event he completes his sentence. So with those things in mind, the death penalty in Malaysia has been something which has been discussed because it is mandatory. The death penalty in Malaysia is mandatory in respect of certain offences, 11 offences to be exact. Murder being one of them, drug trafficking amongst others. So now the question of the effectiveness of the death penalty has come into question, whether or not it has served its purpose in reducing crime rates, for example, reducing incidents of drug trafficking and so on. Various studies and research have found that this is not the case. It's not as effective or not it's as it was thought to be.
Okay.
So hence the reason we have looked into abolishing the mandatory aspect of the death penalty. So that is where we are at now, where the government will be doing the necessary, tabling the necessary bill in Parliament, bills in fact in Parliament to give effect to the abolishment of the mandatory death penalty, meaning that the death penalty still exists. There still is the death penalty in Malaysia, only now that it's for the courts to decide whether or not it should be imposed or whether or not a lesser sentence of imprisonment should be imposed, depending, of course, on the facts and circumstances of a given case.
All right. Ms. Katrina, you were nodding along the whole time as YB was actually sharing his sentiment. I believe that you share the same sentiment as well.
I think, I agree. I also think that it's really important to start by affirming that life is precious. I think at the center of this discussion also is just how we think about the value of life. And for Amnesty International Malaysia, we oppose the death penalty in its totality. It is the ultimate cruel and inhumane punishment. I think the government's move to abolish the mandatory death penalty is a really significant step in what we hope is the full abolition down the road. And I mean, there are numerous reasons for it, right? So one, if you really understand and respect sort of the dignity and the sanctity of life. Two, as YB said, it has not proven to be a deterrent. Right. And you have studies, for example, that compare, say, in Hong Kong and Singapore, both about the same population, a study over 35 years looking at murder rates. And in Hong Kong, they had abolished the death penalty, and there's no real difference in the murder rates when you have the death penalty and when you don't. But I think another really important point is that it disproportionately, the death penalty disproportionately affects people who are already marginalized in society. It has a higher, it harms poor people more. If you look at who's on death row, how people access the criminal justice system, the kind of legal support they get, the resources. If you look at the effect on women, not just the women who are sentenced to death, but women in the families, the loved ones of people on death row. So they really bear the burden of this. And I think we have to look at it holistically as not just in and of itself taking an individual's life is terrible, but also whose life are we taking and the layers of discrimination and marginalization that impact it. And then finally, on the mandatory bit, right now, the judges don't have, for these 11 offences, they cannot look at cases in its totality. They can't look at circumstances or character or history or all of these other nuances which are needed for them to make a decision. And so their hands are tied, essentially. And for these 11 offences, they have to impose the death penalty, whether they agree to it or not.
Yeah, and Mr. Raghunath, as mentioned by YB as well as Ms. Katrina, there are actually 11 offences that that you could be convicted to a mandatory death penalty, and one of it, which I believe that a lot, or even all Malaysians really understand it, is the death penalty that it carries should you deal with drug trafficking specifically. That's actually an article here by the UN. According to the UN, in Malaysia, most of these sentenced to death are charged with drug-related offences, and they have also said that the majority of these offences do not meet the threshold of the most serious crimes, meaning intentional killing, which remains the only category of offence for which the death penalty can be imposed under international law. It only gets doled out against small fishes, and the big culprits are still at large. Again, we're talking about the drug mules. We're talking about those unfortunate souls who were conned into becoming drug traffickers. And does this mandatory death sentence really serves its intended purpose to fight against drug offences, sir?
Well, I'm a lawyer as well.
Yes.
By profession. In terms of the effect of the drug offences, it's extremely harsh to impose a mandatory death penalty. The threshold is very low.
Okay.
15
So what is low?
15 grams of heroin
Okay.
is considered possession, deemed trafficking.
15 grams.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and slightly higher for cannabis. So, in effect, what you have within the drug law is the presumption. When you have a certain amount and you exceed that threshold, you will be deemed to be a trafficker.
Okay.
That is why you mentioned the United Nations study
Yep.
in terms of severity and why most of these cases of people who are on death row are considered drug traffickers. That is according to Malaysian law.
Okay.
And the harshness that you actually impose within our criminal justice system, as Katrina mentioned, I mean, there is a mitigation process.
Yeah.
The judges have to consider the circumstances of the case. But the moment someone is found guilty, there's nothing to mitigate. So it's a formality that the lawyer stands up and says, in mitigation, it doesn't matter. No matter whatever you say, there's only one sentence that can be meted out.
Yeah. So it doesn't really give a chance for you to defend yourself
No.
in any way. The fact that it is seen as that, as a drug trafficker.
For example, if you caught with 15 grams, it doesn't make a difference whether you're caught with 100 grams. So, I mean, in a normal situation,
Yeah.
that should be taken into consideration. And if you could show that I'm a user, I'm not someone who's been selling.
Okay.
I mean, that should be mitigating factors that should be taken into consideration.
Right.
But in a mandatory punishment situation, there's no mitigating factors in terms of sentencing. But I think one important development that we must accept and understand, and which is a great thing for Malaysia, that this abolition of the mandatory death penalty has support from cross parties, both sides. In effect, it was brought in by the previous government,
Okay.
carried on from the previous government, the PH government 2018, carried on by the PN government, then subsequently by the unity government again. So it is quite a fantastic development, which if you asked me 10 years ago, would we ever see the abolition? I didn't think that it would happen. So these are all positive developments within Malaysia, cross-party support, and this is also a start for greater reforms. You also mentioned in terms of the presumption.
Yeah.
So the Home Minister had also mentioned that there's a requirement for reform of drug laws, which is very important.
Yeah. Of course.
So the reform would mean that if you're a user and you're caught with 15 grams, you should not be punished and sent to jail. In fact, you should be sent for rehab. Some form of a treatment, acceptance that this is not a crime per se, and in fact it needs treatment and support and help.
Treat it like more of a sickness than
sickness.
Yeah. There's a fine line to it. I
addiction,
understand. Yeah.
So I mean, if you treat alcohol addiction, you treat nicotine addiction, right? Then all of a sudden you take this class of drugs and you treat them to be a criminal offense.
Yeah.
And I think the other point which is very important to understand is that if you look at the statistics of people on death row, it's the working class, the B40s.
Yeah.
It's never someone who, and you're not ever have the traffickers, the big people who are actually running the syndicate. They are not there. It's the mules, it's the poor unfortunate person who's caught with that straw of heroin.
Yeah.
So it seems to think, as YB also mentioned, that the statistics show that harsh drug laws have not actually reduced the incidence of drug addiction, drug abuse in Malaysia.
Yep.
In 2018, I think we were one of only 15 countries that imposed the death penalty for any drug-related offences. So, it's very clear the pattern globally. People understand that it's quite absurd to be using this. And I'm really encouraged by the shift to think about drugs from a public health lens. That's absolutely what we need to be doing.
All right.
I think the impact on women. So this is a 2019 statistic, but I don't think it's changed too much. 95% of women on death row are there for quote unquote drug trafficking offences. And if you hear the stories, it's women who are couriers. So they are asked to carry a package. They think they're doing a runner job, or they trust the person, or they're duped into it. I mean, you speak to any of the lawyers who take up these cases, but you're trapped in the system because, again, the system has a strange framing of if you have such a small percentage of drugs or amount of drugs, then you're a trafficker. What this does also, I think it gives us a warped sense of, we're going hard on the issue. But actually, we're not addressing any of the root causes. Neither are we addressing the people who are affected. And really, it's easy to say, we show the numbers as if this is actually addressing the issue of drugs, which is a serious issue.
Of course.
But so the shift, both the political shift, but also really bringing multi players on board is fundamental.
Very interesting, because again, sometimes we don't really understand what is the root cause of the offences being perpetrated by all of this, well, quote unquote innocent souls, because again, as what we've already discussed, that some of them are actually being duped and some of them are being conned to do such things. And unfortunately, again, following the letter of the law, we have to implement the mandatory death penalty because that is the law. Having said that, YB, currently we are talking about the mandatory death penalties, abolishing the mandatory factor here, taking that word out, mandatory. What can we expect when it is no longer mandatory? Sir?
Well, I think, when you remove the mandatory part of the death penalty, obviously, then a lot of it comes back into the hands of the court. Meaning that the courts will look at the facts and circumstances of each case. For example, what Raghunath mentioned just now, a person with 15 or more grams of heroin compared to someone with half a kg of heroin. Obviously, there's a vast difference between these two offenders in terms of culpability. So when you talk about what will happen post abolition of the mandatory part, that's where the courts will have a role, a better role, in fact, to mete out a fair and proper sentence in a given case. So in the long term, obviously, when we talk about, and I'm specifically talking about drug trafficking now.
Sure.
Don't get me wrong, drug trafficking is a major problem. And that certainly is something that needs to be addressed. But, whether or not hanging these people is going to solve the problem, I feel that's very doubtful. Like you've heard, most of these people, I think the statistics will show they are drug mules. So, when you are just getting rid of the small fish, you're not getting rid of the main problem. And I think the main problem is not drug use or trafficking, but drug production. You see, when you talk about the menace of drugs, it's the producers, those who produce illegal narcotic substance. These are the ones who we should be going after if our intention really is to
stop,
overcome, or to it
stop
might be difficult to stop, but
sure.
to reduce to a significant
reduce,
extent
the
problem. I think we've got to look at the bigger picture of drug production. And so what will happen, if we were to abolish the mandatory death penalty? I think the mandatory death penalty has not worked to deter drug production. And so, I think what we should be focusing more on is, going after the big fish, if you want to call it that, so that laws and legislation can be enacted with that in mind. So I hope, that will be further along down the line, that we will find solutions, or better ways to deal with the problem.
Okay, it's definitely getting heated up in here, speaking to our three panelists here about this particular topic, about the abolishment of the mandatory death penalty. There's so much more for us to discuss on this show. So we're going to take a short break for a while. Do not go anywhere. Stay with us here on the Wacana English edition on Sinar Daily. We're back soon.
Alright, Sinar Daily is at Splash Mania Gamuda Cove, the new water theme park that just opened.
So for next gen, basically our vision is for families to come here and they create happy memories together as well as one. Because it's a whole family theme park, one thing. And also this is one of the largest indoor theme park. It's about 43,000 square feet.
Wow, that's big!
Thank you so much for staying on with us here on the Wacana English edition tonight. Speaking to you, discussing with all of you guys about the working towards abolishing mandatory death penalty with three panelists that we have here. Again, we have the Deputy Law and Institutional Reforms Minister, YB Ramkarpal Singh, together with the Amnesty International Malaysia Executive Director, Katrina Jorin Maliamau, okay, and of course the Suhakam Commissioner, Mr. Raghunath K7. All right, to continue our discussion right now, moving into block number 2, we want to get more in depth in regards of the cost on inmates as well as the society. I have to ask YB this first question first of all. Pardon me, YB, death penalty. Really, has it really deterred people from committing crime? Because you dangle that notion that should you commit this crime, you will get the death penalty. Does it actually really work specifically in today's day and age?
Personally, I don't think so. And I think this is supported by various studies that have been conducted over the years. I'll refer to a few statistics shortly.
Sure.
But before that, I think we have to understand, I think, when we talk about murder, for example, a lot of cases are spontaneous. Some are premeditated, no doubt about that, but I think a lot of it are spontaneous. So when something like a tragedy like that occurs, it's a lot of times it happens without planning. So the person doesn't think there's a death penalty that might await me if I do this, because that's probably the last thing he has in his mind when he acts spontaneously. So, when we talk about whether it's effective, whether it's been a deterrent, I don't think so. And when we talk about statistics, if I may just refer to a few statistics. For example, in 2018, there was a center called the Abdul Rahman Boraman Center, which conducted a study on the abolition of the death penalty. And the study was done in 11 countries, which abolished the death penalty.
Okay.
And the results saw a decline in murder rates in 10 of those 11 countries.
Of those 11 countries.
Meaning that, there was an actual decline.
Yeah.
The number of murders actually decreased after the abolishment of the death penalty in those countries.
Wow.
Again, right. So that indicates, that it's not been effective. Another one was done by a center called the Death Penalty Information Center. This was specifically in the United States. As you know, in the United States, certain states have retained the death penalty.
Correct.
Certain states have abolished it.
I think Texas is one of it.
Texas, I think, has retained it.
Has retained it?
Retained it, yeah. It's retained it. Yeah. So in that study in the US in 2020, 9 of the 10 states with the highest murder rates during the pandemic were in death penalty states, meaning the states that retained the death penalty.
Okay.
Whereas 8 out of the 11 states with the lowest murder rates during the same pandemic period were in the states which had abolished the death penalty. So there again, you can see, you know, it's not a deterrent.
Yeah.
And in Malaysia as well, you know, since we have imposed our moratorium, you know, from that period on, the statistics show from the Department of Statistics in Malaysia, from 2018 to 2021, those statistics show that there has not been an increase in murder cases, nor has there been an increase in drug addictions in that period. Meaning that since we have suspended the executions of those on death row because of the moratorium, we still there hasn't been an increase in the murder cases, for example.
So the presence or the existence of the mandatory death penalty doesn't really play a part of it at all, if you look at the numbers that you just shared.
Yeah, I've just, and these are just a few of studies. There are quite a few more, which all more or less indicate the same thing, that the death penalty has not been a deterrent, an effective deterrent. And I think that is what we can take away, you know, from this. So I think the best way forward is to come up with ideas, you know, of course, engage with all stakeholders, you know, and to come up with ideas as to how to overcome the real problem in a more holistic manner. Yeah. I think that's what we need to do.
Ms. Katrina?
No, I was going to say, it's not that it's the mandatory death penalty that isn't a deterrent. In all of these studies, it's the death penalty. So even without the mandatory, the death penalty hasn't been a deterrent. And I 100% agree that actually we're at a really great moment to think a bit more imaginatively, think holistically, and understand how can we address really what are the root causes. So with the death penalty there and with it, I think it gives us an easy way out to say that we are going tough on crime. We are, taking a hard stance. Actually, the real hard stance would be to look at, social factors that contribute to people being disenfranchised, to violent behavior, to drug use. And I think there is tons of opportunities for that. I know folks who have been working with formerly incarcerated people who are working on drug reform, human rights actors. It has to be a full society approach. Sure. You have to address gendered violence. You have to address poverty. And maybe that's more complex, but I think it's really achievable. If we break from our minds that this one thing is going to fix all of the issues, and we say, okay, actually, it's 100 different things, but these are all the different players that can come to the table and work it out, we will have the shifts that we need versus sort of keeping ourselves in the cycle of both violence and fallacy.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it's not really that helpful as well. Should all of this, decision makers live in their own silos, thinking about whatever it is just for themselves and not really thinking to the extent, especially when it comes to the welfare of the inmates. I'm drawn to you, sir, Mr. Raghunath. When we talk about inmates, at the end of the day, they are still human beings. They do have rights. They have the right to live. They have the right to be, given the best care possible. Hence why this question is quite interesting, actually. Inmates that are waiting for a death sentence actually spends about 23 hours in their cell and most of their time alone. And how does this impact their mental health, since some would be waiting for years and years to come? It's not like you have been sentenced in mandatory death penalty straight after, a court case, for instance. Some even had to wait years and years. And it is definitely something that no one could actually imagine being in.
Yeah. Can I just put it in the perspective of how a common person would look at it?
Please.
The maxim of innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
That is the cornerstone of the criminal justice system in Malaysia. But unfortunately, when you have the death penalty cases, bail is denied. There's no bail provision.
Yeah.
Therefore, even if after 5 years you're found innocent, you've wasted 4 years, 5 years of your life. So technically what it means is the moment you are charged, you are sentenced until completion of your case and completes the full appeal process. That's number one. Therefore, this innocent until proven guilty concept maxim doesn't apply. That's number one.
Okay.
And This is prison statistics. We have about 72,000 prisoners in 45 prisons in Malaysia. 35% of them are on remand persons because of drug offences.
Okay.
And statistics again, some cases take up to 3-4 years before it goes to trial.
Yeah. That's a long time.
Long time. And as YB Ramkarpal mentioned earlier, because of the mandatory death penalty, there's no rehabilitation concept for persons who have been found guilty. And therefore, the 23 hours, solitary, kept in a separate area of the prison to rot.
Yeah.
So, obviously, right, I mean, the effect, number one, is on the person itself. What about the family?
Yeah.
I mean, your visitation and expectation. And it's not a situation where someone is found guilty in the High Court and the next day is executed. The process takes at least 4 or 5 years. Second tier of appeal, first tier of appeal to Court of Appeal, then to the Federal Court. Then it doesn't end there. You have the Pardons Board.
Yeah.
If it sits. We have a situation on record as a complaint that has been lodged with Suhakam. Someone has been on death row for 35 years.
Say again, sorry? 35 years?
Yes,
On death row for 35 years and still waiting.
waiting.
For
Being on death row in itself is inhumane. You know, when
Yes.
can you imagine?
Yes.
Not knowing your fate.
Yeah.
How when are you going to be hanged tomorrow?
Yeah.
Or do you have another week
Yeah.
of life, or will it happen next year? Can you imagine having those thoughts in your head every day
every single day.
for 35 years in that person's case, or even if it's just a few years? I mean, that in
Yeah.
itself is a very is a punishment in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what Mr. Raghunath actually mentioned as well, Ms. Katrina, the impact doesn't just fall on the victims, doesn't just fall on the inmates, but the
Yeah.
family as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
The suffering of what they had to go through.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine 35 years on the outside, not knowing whether your loved one inside will end or not.
I want to thank you also for asking the question about the 23 hours in solitary. Even short amounts of solitary confinement are really damaging.
Even we got cooped up during MCO. We got crazy. ourselves.
It's a terrible but great comparison, right?
Yeah.
Because the access and the agency that we have is very different from. But yes, you're absolutely right. When I think sometimes we can speak about deprivation of liberty as just behind bars. But it's a very, very serious thing, and detention has serious impacts on individuals. And then you take it to the next level where it's solitary confinement, the deprivation of human contact. You're not allowed to hold, touch, speak to people, and it's the psychological damage is quite severe. And so then you have folks for years and years. I mean, it is cruel and inhumane punishment. And it really, there should be a prohibition on that, right? And so I think the impacts on the individual, and as YB very rightly pointed out, the not knowing, but then the families too. And their loved ones. And I think when we speak about the choices we make as to how we want to punish individuals, nobody is just an individual in isolation. We are connected to networks of people who rely on us, who love us, who need us. And so the spirals of harm then to their children, to their family members, they may be breadwinners. We speak to sort of families of people on death row. Often they are held in prisons that are not in the same state where they're at. And we already talked about how it's predominantly people who are poor, people who are marginalized. That means that they can't afford to take the time off to have the money to travel across state to go and visit during these very restricted hours. You have the loss of sort of income. There was that case of Hairun Jalani from Sabah, the single mother who was, she's a fish seller, found with some meth on her, sentenced to death because of the mandatory. And she has, several children who are now, they don't have their mother, they don't have their primary caregiver. Or you have foreigners who are on death row, also for a majority are there because of drug offences and the mandatory death penalty. And what support do they have? They don't have family that can easily come and see them. And so the harm here really is not ever contained in just that one person. And so the choices that we make in our criminal justice system, that's why we keep sort of harping on the holistic approach, because everybody is affected.
But YB, there are some corners of society who would just shout out and say, they deserved it. They committed that offense. There's no two ways about it. You should be hanged. You should be, going through all of this because of what you have done.
Yes.
Your comment.
I mean, that's, what we call the eye for an eye concept.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we have to also look at it from all angles. We have to understand where they come from, the victims, their families. Of course, you sympathize with them. There's no doubt about that. But I think for me, in terms of, you can never compensate the loss of a life. I think that much is very clear. But to take away another life, I think might be a bit harsh. In certain circumstances. And like I said earlier at the outset of this talk, in this country, I mean, the death penalty is still there. I think we have to remember that it is still there. It can happen, or it can be imposed in obviously if the facts and circumstances of a case so warrant. For example, in India, they have also done away with their mandatory death penalty, although they've retained the death penalty, and it's been used very sparingly, in very rare cases. I think there was this famous or infamous case of a girl who was raped or gang raped in a moving bus. I think it was about 5 years ago or so, or something. And she eventually also, unfortunately, she didn't make it. She died. And that was one of the rare cases where the courts in India, I think, imposed the death penalty. So it can still be imposed, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. But whether or not it's justified to take away a life, I don't know. I have my reservations.
All right. No, before you go on, I do want to ask you, because again, loving the fact that you've been nodding along, you wanting to say something, I just want to ask a question on you. You are pro-rehabilitation. Like, for whatever it is, I mean, regardless of the crime that has been committed, you are pro-rehabilitation. Am I correct in saying so?
Yeah, and I think the purpose of any criminal justice system, any incarceration, has to be some form of rehabilitation. And we are also, we don't believe that the death penalty should exist, full stop. And I don't think saying that means that we are diminishing the harm and the impact on the individuals who have lost loved ones, who have suffered heinous crimes, right? Actually, I think that it is, when both, like what YB said, the eye for an eye, I think that our approaches can't be rooted in vengeance. I think they have to be, often for people who have lost loved ones, the death penalty doesn't really genuinely ease their suffering. What it does is that it extends the suffering onto now another family. There are victims groups around the world who have lost their loved ones to murder, who are now campaigning against the death penalty because they understand really the harms of it. And I just want to share this one group in Japan called Ocean. It was formed in 2012 by Masaharu Harada, whose younger brother was brutally murdered. And Ocean is a support group of others who've been affected by murder, but also they work with offenders and their families. And in an interview in 2007, this is what Harada said, and I'll quote. He said, "Our life itself was completely destroyed because of the man who murdered my brother, and I was consumed with hatred. Honestly speaking, there is no way I could ever forgive him, even now. But I wanted to know more about the crime. And I also felt that I had an account to settle with Hasegawa, the guy who committed the murder." And so what he did was that he had ended up meeting with the perpetrator 4 times, he was trying to come to terms and understand why his brother was murdered, what drove that man to commit this terrible crime.
Yep.
But then the perpetrator was then hanged in 2001. And he said, and I quote, "The government deprived me of my opportunity to interact with him. Through the meetings, I was just beginning to understand who he was." And so he's saying here that what you need really also as part of that healing is a space to make sense of this horrifying thing that happened to you. To part of it is sometimes people needing to connect and reach out to the perpetrators, but also I think we have to expand our imagination of what justice means.
Yeah.
I think, when it comes to somebody who has lost their loved one from the crime of murder, or you've suffered a really grievous harm, I think it's worth asking, okay, how do we repair the harm?
Yeah.
What does it mean to heal? What could we give in terms of resources or financial support to ensure that the victims and their families now can continue? How do we repair the fractures that have taken place? I think those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to justice. Not, I am going to operate just from a place of anger, hatred, and vengeance, which absolutely are valid emotions, but cannot be the
Sole
start and
drive.
ending point in which we make a decision.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Definitely a deep conversation, a deep discussion together with our panelists speaking about this topic. But we do have to take a short break right now. Right after this, we're going to be coming back and discussing about going beyond death penalty. Stay with us here on Wacana English Edition on Sinar Daily.
This is our main attraction. This is a ninja challenge.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much once again for staying on with us here on Wacana English Edition. Tonight, as mentioned, we are talking about a very, very deep topic, which is working towards abolishing mandatory death penalty. And we have come to the last block of our discussion today, block number 3, in which that we're going to be talking about going beyond the death penalty. Let's kick things off with block number 3. Let's go to Mr. Raghunath first. Now, going beyond death penalty, as what the title suggests for this segment, is it time for us to try out new approaches other than the recarceration as punishment, especially for petty crimes? What do you think, sir?
In fact, the last 4 or 5 years, there's been quite a lot of prison reforms.
Okay.
You have community service being introduced, which is amazing. And these reforms has the full support of the Prisons Department.
All right.
The Director General is a very progressive person who believes in reform. You should call him to attend one of these.
I'll take a note of that for
yes.
sure.
and I will say this in terms of the new approach is towards community justice. So, and statistics have shown that when you have community justice, where someone is sent back to the community to do some form of community service with some restrictions in terms of mobility, movement, reporting, the chances of reoffending is much, much less. When someone is kept incarcerated for 5 years, he's out of touch with society.
Yes.
And the chances are that he will make new friends in prison, go out and reoffend again.
Yeah.
Because there's no opportunity, he's lost the ability to earn an income, to work, and the stigma that comes with it. But in fact, if he's sent back to the community, there's greater chance that there will be rehabilitation within the community, because he can now be productive. And if he's the sole breadwinner, he can again go back and assist the family and things like that. That's very important.
Yeah.
And I think, as you mentioned, if it's minor offences, drug usage, for instance, a reoffender gets 6 months, 8 months, 5 years. We have harsh laws on drug usage. So, does it actually serve the purpose when you take away a breadwinner, you take away a woman who cares for the child, and you break up the family? So, if you talk about the economic cost to society, it's huge. And the problems you create, unemployment, dependence on the state, broken families, and serious social problems because there's no father figure, no mother figure in the family. The children are left on their own devices, and you have all kinds of social problems. So I think quite rightly, when you look at the reforms that are required, we need to go towards a more community-based provisions for sentencing. If it is a sentence, if it's a crime which is a minor offense or whatever it is, you can serve perhaps at the moment you get 1/3 off for good behavior. But now what has happened is that they actually brought it down to you serve 1/3 and your 2/3 go back into the community. So it gives more options for someone to have a second chance in life.
All right. Well, would that be something, YB, would that be something that, Malaysia would consider actually to make our justice, crime and punishment system more equitable, giving, more opportunities for these minor offenders, as what was portrayed by Mr. Raghunath in regards of that? What do you think?
I think it's a good idea to allow them the chance of somehow being what's the word, relevant to the community. I think if you are put away for a long period of time, you lose the abilities to do certain basic things like earn an income. That would would defeat the purpose of what you want the person to be like when he is eventually released, which is to be be beneficial to the community when he comes back out again. That will make deter him from committing further crimes upon release. And I think so when you look at these, you take these factors into account, look at it in a more from a bigger angle. I think one way forward is certainly looking at it from community angle, as mentioned by Raghunath earlier. And I think particularly for minor offences, where I think this might be slightly digressing, but I think it is relevant to a certain extent, is the problem of prison congestion, overcrowding in prisons.
Okay.
And like it was pointed out by Raghu earlier, we have around 73,000 inmates in prisons across the country.
45 prison that was.
I think it's and the prison capacity is around only about 64 or 65,000. So you've got about
about 10,000. Yeah.
more than its capacity. In fact, I had occasion to visit the two main prisons recently, in Sungai Buloh and also in Kajang. You can see, it's quite obvious that that they are overcrowded. And so if you're going to pack prisons with, with those who commit minor petty crimes, I think it's going to just contribute to the problem, make it worse.
Okay.
And so I think we have to, the time has come to look at, alternatives, to the traditional view of incarcerating a person. Community, the community angle is certainly one to look at and to study in greater detail, so that perhaps we can come up with better laws in the future.
Yep. Coming back to the, giving that chance, giving them community work, letting them go, and not let them being incarcerated for a longer time. Unfortunately, Miss Katrina, is that there's always this stigma in Malaysia. People are always going to be pointing fingers at, okay, he went to jail, he went to prison, he's an offender, don't come near my family. It's always going to be there regardless. So there's already a bit of a gap there already, and it makes life much harder for anyone to actually get used to it without proper help and proper guidance.
I don't know that it'll always be there. I think it's there because of the ways in which we think and talk about crime, and also the norms that we set through these punishment systems that are not effective. And so if you have a system that says it's okay to just really throw people in behind bars in poor, squalid conditions, overcrowding, but they deserve it because they are prisoners. We diminish the humanity and the dignity that is inherent to all of us, whether, regardless of whether we're innocent or guilty. So again, that's a cultural norm. It's a political norm that is created because of the system that we make. So if we chose to make another system, I think that also creates other ways in which we think about it. Think about when people commit crimes, they are not the sum of, people are not the worst thing that they've done. We are people who are complex. We create crime. We commit crimes for a multitude of reasons. Sometimes it's out of our control. Sometimes it's the environment and circumstances we're in. And so I think the messaging that I've been encouraged by, for Prisons Department, from the government, saying, okay, we need to have a shift in the perspective. We need to think about restorative justice. We need to think about community approaches. I know that there are amazing NGOs out there who work with formerly incarcerated people. We have groups like Malaysia Care, for example, or the U-Turn Project. And then you also have family members of people on death row who are doing really, amazing work within the community. Groups like Sebaran Kasih. And I'd really urge listeners to look in these programs and support it, because 100% agree that the stigma right now is very high. And so we all have a role to play to bridge that, to make ourselves accessible. And again, in our language, in the way we talk about crime, talk about people who commit crimes, that we affirm people's humanity and understand that people's rights are inherent to all of us, and so is our dignity. And I started off by saying, life is precious, and that life is precious is not only about whether you live or die, but in how you are allowed to live and be in this world.
And coming back to you, YB, when it comes to prison, to run a prison, it does take a lot of cost, and that is actually our own money, the Malaysia's taxpayers' money. We are actually funding this, and building more prisons is definitely not a solution, isn't it?
Yes, of course. I mean, the cost factor is certainly something that you have to consider very seriously. I think that it's actually more expensive to cater for those on death row, I think, than other inmates, because of certain logistical reasons. But yes, when you have prison overcrowding, you have to think about, food, transportation for them to be taken to court and back, the quarantine period, medical assistance, all these add up in terms of costs. So, it doesn't necessarily, and of course it's coming from the taxpayers, as you correctly pointed out, from you and me.
Yep.
But but I think the more important consideration is this: whether or not it is necessary to overcrowd the prison. Certainly with with petty or smaller offences, I think we should be looking at alternative views, alternative ways to rather than the traditional incarceration approach.
Okay. Yeah, please.
I don't have the answer, but actually I wanted to
Alright.
ask the lawyer and YB colleagues here about the statistics of the number of people in prison who are there either because they can't post bail and also like legal
Yeah,
representation.
I wanted to address that. I think one of the needs for reform is in the bail process and procedure.
Okay.
So bail means that you have to put up a sum of money, generally. In most cases, that's what the court wants. But you fail to realize that someone with means to put up 2 million ringgit is nothing.
Yeah.
Someone who's poor, who's a rubber tapper in Gua Musang, for instance, how is that person going to come up with 3,000 or 5,000 ringgit?
Yeah.
And that is one of the reasons for overcrowding in prisons, because
They can't post
the
bail.
courts need to also reform.
Yeah.
They need to look at other options rather than asking them to put up 5,000 ringgit as bail money, for instance. So, I mean, when we talk about reform, prison reforms, overcrowding, 35% of the population of prisons are remand prisoners.
Okay.
That means the trial hasn't gone on. They're sitting there waiting for a court date.
Yeah.
So if you take out
They
35,
might be found innocent.
Yeah, they might be found
Yeah.
innocent. Yeah.
Eventually.
35. That's a huge number.
That's a huge
35%.
How
number.
long are they on average?
so our statistics,
Uh-huh.
some are even held for 4 years, 5 years before the matter is heard.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you can't afford your 3,000 ringgit, off you go to prison and wait for your case to be called up.
Sentencing, yeah.
So, I mean, we talk about cost, we talk about the taxpayers' burden. So, we need to look at a holistic approach to reform of the law, reform of drug laws, reform of the criminal justice system, the way that it should not be skewed against someone who's poor.
All right.
Bail is something like, I mean, a recent case, 2 million. Quite easy to raise if you're rich.
Yeah. But having said that, though, Mr. Raguna, coming back to YB, how easy it is for us to actually, get this reform? Like, for instance, like what Mr. Raguna has mentioned about the bail. I mean, how easy it is for our country, Malaysia, to actually come up with something new that is being accepted and passed through the respective parties. Is it that simple?
You see, bail, I think, is very much is a very vital part of the criminal justice system. In some cases, are unbailable, meaning that some certain offences or certain certain laws do not prescribe bail to begin with.
Yep.
So in those cases, the person, whether he can afford it or not, is denied bail. So there's quite a number of cases like that which have contributed to, prison congestion as well. So the question is, how easy would it be to sort of amend or reform laws related to bail? I think that is something, it's not an easy task, because bail has always been and will always be a very integral part of the criminal justice system. But I think there can be ways to improve bail. For example, by imposing a bond as opposed to a monetary sort of penalty, like 3,000, 5,000, 20,000 for a certain offense. Other kinds of bonds can be looked at, to alternatives, which would serve the same purpose and is more practical in nature. So I think that those are aspects we can be looking into.
We're running almost out of time here on this show. Yeah, I know that Ms. Katrina is quite disappointed in that, but I do want to give a chance to each and every one of our panelists to give a minute of your time to just address, to give a bit of a conclusion of what we have spoken about today and your hopes and dreams and what you want Malaysia at least to be on the way, on the guidelines of moving forward. We start with you, sir.
As I mentioned earlier, we had support, cross-party support for the abolition of the mandatory death penalty, which is amazing. 10 years ago, we did not even have the discussion on this matter. That's number one. And we're talking about reforms to prison. We're we're talking of, we're looking at the community form of justice, which is amazing. I have hope. I believe with young progressive leaders like YB Ramkarpal with us, there's real hope for change. And with support from all the other stakeholders, why not?
Lovely.
We can do it.
Great. All right, Ms. Katrina, floor's yours.
Yeah, I will say firstly to the government, I'm really hoping and praying that the mandatory death penalty amendments go through, but I really want us to move towards full abolition. I know it's a journey and know this is a critical step. I truly believe we can, as a country, join the global trends in moving away from the death penalty. I think to people in Malaysia, I started off again by saying that life is precious. I truly believe that. I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all of us. I think our lives are a lot more connected to each other than we sometimes pretend it to be. And so what happens to people behind bars, what happens to victims and perpetrators affects us too. And I want us to open our imagination for the different ways we can be, and to think a lot more holistically, to put human rights at the center of our analysis and our responses. And yes, the struggles may be difficult, but they are absolutely not impossible. It's impossible until it's done. And so, we should just claim and go for the changes that we want and not feel afraid that we're not going to get there, because we can.
Well said. And last but not least, of course, YB.
Well, I think just to answer what she just said, the amendments will be tabled in this current sitting, which ends in the first week of April. So we hope to get it passed by then. As far as I'm concerned, my ministry, as the name itself suggests, is to do with reform.
Yeah.
And that's what
it's in the name.
Yeah, it's in the name. It's in the name. Yeah, exactly. So I can't run away from it. But
sure.
But I think this government is reform-minded, and I think there have been many things that we have looked at in terms of reform. This is just one, the mandatory death penalty. There are many other initiatives that we are looking into, which are reform-minded. For example, citizenship laws, which are a bit archaic and outdated. Would also be looked into for their improvement. Other laws which are outdated will also be looked at. So that is my commitment, and I think in this ministry, and we hope that we can do as much as we can as in the near future.
Well said, well said. That's a very good summary by all of our panelists over here. Once again, we do like to thank very much to all our panelists, starting with obviously the Deputy Law and Institutional Reforms Minister. We have YB Ramkarpal Singh, together with Ms. Katrina Jorin Maliamau, the Amnesty International Malaysia Executive Director, and as well as to Mr. Raghunath K7, Suhakam Commissioner. Thank you so much for coming down tonight. Well, that has been a very fruitful, a very in-depth discussion in regards of our topic today, working towards abolishing mandatory death penalty. At the end of the day, every life is precious. It's how you treat it. Everybody deserves a second chance, whether you want to give it or not. That's what we're trying to reform. That's what we're trying to do the best moving forward for a better Malaysia. And for everyone who's watching us tonight, again, thank you so much for staying with us throughout this Friday night episode. Make sure you guys do follow us on all our socials, on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, as well as our website for all of the latest information on everything and anything that is happening, not just in Malaysia, but throughout the world as well on Sinar Daily. It has been a pleasure. My name is Meor Addelan. We'll see you soon on the next one. Take care. Assalamualaikum. Very good night. Bye. All right.